In this video, I'm going to show you how to round decimals. So let's say we have the number 452 and 297 thousandths. Let's start by imagining a number line that goes forever to the left and forever to the right. And on the left, we'll call this negative infinity. On the right, we'll call this positive infinity. And of course, somewhere halfway in between would be 0. So let's say that we want to start out by taking our number 452 and 297 thousandths and rounding this to the nearest hundred. Well, let's see if we can find 400 on our number line, because in the number there's a 4 in the hundreds place, so we know we have at least 400. I'm just going to go ahead and mark a spot. Let's call this 400. This obviously won't be drawn to scale because this number line stretches infinitely in both directions. And I know my number is more than 400. I have a 4 in the hundreds place, but then I have some digits in the tens place, the ones place, and so on. So I know it's more than 400. I'm just going to skip count by 100, and I'm going to call this right over here 500. So I know my number is somewhere in between those 2 points. I'm going to pretend like we're zooming in, though, between those 2 points, and I'm just going to draw this out like this. And I'm going to connect the endpoints here, and this will represent right over here. This will represent 400, and this over here will represent 500. I know halfway between 400 and 500 is 450. So now I'm going to go ahead and try to place my number 452 and 297 thousandths, and I'm thinking it's going to be somewhere right over in here. And if I look at my zoomed in number line, all I'm trying to do now to round this to the nearest hundred is decide which of these hundreds is the number closest to. This is basically like if I were trying to pay somebody and all I had were $100 bills, and I wanted to give them the closest amount to how much I owe, and I owed $452. Which hundred would I give them? Would I give them 400 or 500? And in this case, because 452 and 297 thousandths is more than halfway from 400 to 500, it's past 450, it's going to round all the way up to 500 when rounding to the nearest hundred. So let's imagine now that we were rounding that same number to the nearest 10. Now I know that I have at least 45 tens because I can see right here I have a 5 right here in the tens place, but this 4 actually represents 40 tens. 40 tens is 400. So I really have 45 tens right here, which is 450. I also have parts of another 10 because 2 is part of a 10. It's not all the way there to a 10, but it is part of a 10, and so are these decimals over here. So I know I have at least 45 tens. Somewhere over here is going to be 46 tens, otherwise known as 460. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to zoom in on this number line and connect the dots. So over here would be 450. Right over here is 460. I know my number 452 and 297 thousandths. It's going to be pretty close to 450, but let's put the midpoint just so we can make sure we get it in the right spot. Midpoint is going to be 455, and 452 and 297 thousandths, maybe somewhere right about here. So if we're rounding to this to the nearest 10, we're not to the midpoint, so we're going to go backwards this direction. The nearest 10 would be 450. This is another case where you can think of this as this time all we have is $10 bills, and we're trying to pay this person the absolute closest amount that we owe them with just $10 bills. The closest 10 would be 450. I'm going to scoot the number line up here because we're going to pretend like next that we are rounding to the nearest whole number. In other words, we're going to round to the ones place. And to do that, we're going to continue to zoom in. Now, if we look at our number, we know that we have 452 ones and then part of another one in the decimal place values. So I'm going to look at 452, which is somewhere, let's say right about here. And then 453, maybe right about here. And this is not going to be perfect, but we're going to zoom in between 452 right here and 453 right here, just like we did before. And let me connect these to make a new number line. So here's 452, and here's 453. Halfway between 452 and 453 is 452 and a half, 5/10. My number, 452 and 297 thousandths, has a 2 in the tenths place, and then it has a little bit more in the hundredths and thousandths. It's actually really close to 452 and 3/10. So I'm going to say it's maybe right about here on this number line. And when I'm rounding this to the nearest whole, the nearest to the ones place, I'm not halfway to 453, so I'm going to round down to 452. Now notice when I'm rounding to different place values, for example, right over here where I rounded to the nearest 100, well, the number that I rounded to is a multiple of 100 because I'm skip counting by hundreds and I'm trying to find the 100 that's closest to my number. Over here, when I rounded to the nearest 10, I ended up with a multiple of 10. And when I rounded to the nearest whole, I ended up with a multiple of 1. Let's next try to round to the nearest tenth. And it looks like my number has 452 wholes and then 2/10, which is going to be just a little bit less than it because it actually has 2/10 and then part of another tenth. So I'm going to put this, let's see, 452 and 2/10, maybe right about here. It's going to get hard for me to write all of this in. And then 452 and 3/10, somewhere right in here. And I'm getting even worse off scale as I zoom in just because my numbers are getting compacted. But let's go ahead and zoom in and create us a new number line. This end will be 452 and 2/10, and over here will be 452 and 3/10, because I know my number is in between those 2/10. Halfway between 452 and 2/10 and 452 and 3/10 is 452 and 25 hundredths. And if you can't see that, we can always put a 0 in the hundredths place right here and right here. And then you can see between 20 hundredths and 30 hundredths is going to be 25 hundredths. Let's now plot our point, 452, and if we look at the hundredths now, we're about 29 hundredths with a little bit more. So it's going to be pretty close right over here somewhere. I'm going to have to not put it right next to the 30 hundredths over there, because I'm going to run out of room otherwise. But it's clearly more than halfway, so it's going to round up to 452 and 30 hundredths or 452 and 3/10. Let's do one more zooming in, one more rounding. And this time we're going to round 452 and 297 thousandths to the nearest hundredth. So I'm going to have to scroll up a little bit. And I know that I have at least 29 hundredths, and 452 and 29 hundredths is going to be somewhere right about, let's call it right about here. I'm going to have to really try to squeeze this in. Of course, I know where 452 and 30 hundredths is. That's right here. It's already marked on my number line. So my number is somewhere in between. Let's zoom in and make us a new number line. And label the endpoints 452 and 29 hundredths, 452 and 30 hundredths. Halfway on this number line is going to be 452 and 295 thousandths. Again, if you can't see that, you can always put a 0 in the thousandths place. And then in between 290 and 300 thousandths is 295 thousandths. And of course, the whole number is not going to change. Plotting my number, it's going to be somewhere in between 295 and 300 thousandths. So somewhere right, maybe over here. 452 and 297. But that tells me it's definitely going to round up to 452 and 300 thousandths, or 452 and 30 hundredths. Now let's scroll back down and look for some patterns here. So when I began, I first started rounding to the nearest hundred. And when I looked at the nearest hundred, this was my hundreds place right up here. There's the hundreds place. So here was the hundreds place. Here was the hundreds place. When I marked 450 on here, the midpoint, notice that the digit just to the right of the hundreds place, the tens place, is a 5. And in my number, my original number, it was also a 5. So that tells me that my number is at least halfway between 400 and 500. So as a result, my number went up. Even if it was right on exactly 450, the convention says that we would round up anytime it's at least halfway. When I rounded to the nearest 10, here was my tens place, the 5 right here. So 45 tens, the 5 right here, or 46 tens, the next 10 up. When I found the midpoint, I had 45 tens, and then the digit to the right, the ones place, was a 5 again. So 445 tens, and then a half of another 10. And my original number, I had 45 tens, but the digit just to the right of the tens place was not a 5, which means I did not have at least half of another 10. So as a result, my number fell on this side, this half of the midpoint, and rounded down to 450. If I scroll up some more, when I rounded to the nearest whole, to the ones place, here's the digit in the ones place. So I had 452 ones on this end of the number line, 453 ones over here. The digit just to the right of the ones place is the tenths place. Notice the midpoint, the tenths place would have to be a 5, halfway. My digit just to the right of the ones place was a 2, so as a result, I know it's going to be on the left side, so it's going to round down to just 452 wholes. When I rounded to the nearest tenth, I had 452 wholes and 2 tenths right here. Here's the tenths place. So that's where I started over here. Then I skip counted by tenths, 452 and 3 tenths over here. The digit just to the right of the tenths is the hundredths, and I have way more than half. Here would be half. The digit just to the right of the tenths would be halfway, 5. I have way more than that, way over here, which is why I rounded up. And lastly, when I rounded to the nearest hundredth, this is the hundredths place. So I started my number line with 452 and 29 hundredths, and I entered it with the next hundredth up, 452 and 30 hundredths. Midway is going to be the digit just to the right. The thousandths place is going to be a 5 midway. My digit just to the right of the hundredths place is a 7, which is why I rounded all the way up to 452 and 300 thousandths, or 452 and 30 hundredths. So let's now look at some more examples. Let's say I have the number 372 and 964 thousandths. And let's say we want to round this number to the nearest whole. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to find out how many wholes that I definitely have. And I definitely have 372 because this is the ones place right here. So I know if I'm imagining a number line where I'm already zoomed in, I know that it's going to start at 372 because I definitely have 372 ones. And if I skip count by ones, the next number will be 373. So my number, 372 and 964 thousandths, is somewhere in between on this number line. Halfway on this number line, halfway between 372 and 373, is 372.5, 372 and 5 tenths. My number has 9 tenths, so my number is going to be somewhere over here. And it had 9 tenths and then some hundredths and some thousandths. But regardless, it's going to end up rounding up to 373. Now, once you get good at visualizing these number lines in your head, you won't need to draw a number line just to be able to round to a given place value. All you'll have to do is identify the place value that you're wanting to round to and look at the digit just to the right and decide if it's a 5 or above. If it's a 5 or above, you're going to round up. And if it's below a 5, you're going to round down. So in this case, because the digit was a 9, I rounded up to 373. If this digit right here had been a 4, for example, I would have rounded down to 372. Let's try 698 and 29 hundredths. And this time, let's round to the nearest tenth. So I need to identify how many tenths I have. And I have 698 wholes and 2 tenths because this is the tenths place. If I were to draw a number line, the beginning of my number line would be 698 wholes and 2 tenths. And then the next tenth up would be 698 wholes and 3 tenths. So in this example, this might be me only having a whole bunch of dimes, and all I could do is pay this person in dimes. And which would be the nearest dime, if I'm paying with them with dimes, what would be the nearest dime that would get closest to the amount of money that I owed them? Halfway would be 698 and 25 hundredths. And I know this because this has a 0 in the hundredths. This has a 0 in the hundredths. So between 20 hundredths and 30 hundredths is 25 hundredths. My number, though, has a 9 right here in the hundredths place. I have 29 hundredths as well as the 698 wholes. So that would end up being somewhere way over here, which means I'm going to round all the way up here to 698 and 30 hundredths or 698 and 3 tenths. Again, once you're good at this, you can just look at the place value that you're rounding to, in this case the tenths place, look to the digit to the right. This is more than halfway because it's greater than a 5, so as a result, I know I'm going to round the tenths up. And everything over here, all the whole numbers over here are going to stay the same because this is where I am on the number line. I've zoomed in to 698, and all I'm looking at is between 2 tenths and 3 tenths past that number. Let's try, let's do 908 and 47 thousandths. This time let's round to the nearest hundredth. So first I need to identify the hundredths place, which is this right here. The 4 is in the hundredths place. So I know I'm zooming all the way in on a number line to 908 and 4 hundredths. And if I skip count by hundredths, then I'm at 908 and 5 hundredths after it. So my number should be somewhere in between. And I know halfway in between is going to be 908 and 45 thousandths. I know that because between 40 thousandths and 50 thousandths is 45 thousandths. And of course, all of these numbers are zoomed into the 908 wholes. So now I just need to locate my original number, 908 and 47 thousandths, which I think is somewhere right in here. Because it's more than halfway, we're going to round up to 908 and 50 thousandths or 908 and 5 hundredths. Again, I can look at the place value that I'm rounding to, the hundredths place. The digit just to the right tells me that I'm more than halfway to the next hundredth, so I'm going to round up to the next hundredth. Notice that when I did this, I still put all of the whole numbers in front of this because it wouldn't make sense for me to say that this whole number right here is close to just 5 hundredths. It is close to 5 in the hundredths place, but it is on our number line, we're still at 908 plus those 5 hundredths. Let's try 391 and 254 thousandths. This time, let's round this to the nearest whole. So I need to find out how many wholes I have. And I have 391 wholes because this is the ones place. So if I were to draw a number line, I would zoom all the way into 391, skip count by wholes, and I would end up at 392. Halfway would be 391 and a half. If I were to look at my number, I'd see that my number is 391 with 2 tenths and then some hundredths and thousandths. 391 and 2 tenths. It's going to be somewhere right over here. And because I'm not halfway, I'm going to round down to 391. And again, if I look at my number, here's the ones place. Just to the right is the tenths place, and I don't have 5 tenths, so I'm not halfway to the next whole. So as a result, I'm going to round all of this decimal right here down, and I'm going to end up with just 391 wholes. Now be careful when I'm using the terminology rounding down, I actually am rounding this number down because I'm rounding it to a number that's below that number, but I'm not rounding the ones place down. I'm rounding all of this, the decimal part of the number. I'm basically taking that decimal part of the number off to round to the nearest whole. Let's try one more example, and this time we're going to round to every place value that we can. So our number is going to be 523 and 74 thousandths. So we're going to round to the hundreds, to the tens, to the ones, to the tenths, and to the hundreds. I'm going to try doing these without looking at drawing number lines this time. So when we're rounding to the nearest hundred, we need to identify our hundreds place value. So here's the hundreds place. We're going to look just to the right because that's going to tell us if we're halfway to the next hundred. And our digit just to the right in the tens place is a 2. So I know between 500 and 600 is 550. I only have 520. So that's not going to be enough to round up. So I'm going to round it all the way down to the nearest hundred, which would be 500. Rounding to the nearest 10, the 2 is in the tens place, so I have 52 tens and then part of another 10. So if I look just to the right of the tens place, I have the ones place, and I'm not halfway to the next 10, so I'm going to round all the way down to 52 tens, otherwise known as 520. Rounding to the nearest whole, here's the ones place. I have 523 ones. If I look just to the right, this is the tenths place. And if this were halfway to the next whole, this would be a 5, but it's lower than that. So all of this part right here is going to be rounded down, and I'm going to be left with just 523 ones. Rounding to the nearest tenth, this is the tenths place, this 0 right here. So I know I have 523 wholes and no tenths. Halfway to the next tenth would be a 5 right here, and I have a 7 right here. So I know I'm more than halfway to the next tenth. So that means I'm going to round up to the next tenth, which would be 523 wholes and then 1/10. And lastly, rounding to the nearest hundredth, here's the hundredths place is 7. Looking to the digit to the right, the thousandths place, halfway to the next hundredth would be a 5 here, and I do not have a 5 here. So I'm going to round this 4 thousandths all the way down, and I'm going to be left with 523 wholes and 7 hundredths.